Hi everybody, it's great to be standing in front of you again today, this time to present. The title of this talk is Are We Safe from Another Gold King Spill? I wanted to start the discussion today talking about the difference between a blowout and persistent pollution. A lot of folks say, how can we prevent another Gold King? And there's kind of two different things going on with Gold King. Next, a really brief section on the state of the river, really pointing towards mountain studies and the great work that they're doing. And then I want to get into a little bit of discussion around problems and solutions. I want to talk about something called the 1872 mining law, Good SAM legislation, regulatory reform, some of these big things that are really going to be needed for our community if we're going to address the threat of a future Gold King, or really the ongoing pollution that gets into the Animas. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about next steps on Gold King and Upper Animas cleanup. So to start, pollutions versus persistent, blowouts versus persistent pollution, excuse me. I was actually like, what is the actual definition of a blowout? And so a blowout is sudden rupture, right? This is a picture taken a screenshot from the EPA video of when the Gold King blowout happened, like that moment. And I hadn't seen that video in a while. I think we were all traumatized enough by it last August. And I saw it again, and it really is like awe-inspiring to see what happened and how quickly a very stable situation went very, very horribly wrong. But a blowout happens in old historic mining districts. It's when buildup of water and pressure eventually overcomes whatever barrier is holding that polluted mine water back, and you have this big catastrophic event. Then there's this question of persistent pollution. This is the Red and Bonita draining mine adit, and this drainage right here is actually the drainage, if you go a little bit up it, where Gold King is. So in the Upper Animas historic mining district, lots of old mine sites and lots of draining adits. And while we had a lot of focus on Gold King, I think our community, a lot of folks in our community anyway, quickly pivoted from talking about the blowout of Gold King to talking about this persistent addition of pollution to the Animas and to our waterways. And this site has looked like this for a long time. It's not dramatic. It doesn't flow past Durango in a big orange plume, but it's adding orders of magnitude more polluted water to our waterways every single year than the Gold King mine event did. So there's a real difference between the blowout that happened, this big kind of catastrophic event, and this persistent pollution that really confronts us every single minute of every single day. The difference, well, there's lots of differences, but one of the big differences is when you have a blowout, you have this, right? The media descends, and all of a sudden Durango is known the world over for having an orange river. This is a random way to look at it, but this is the Alliance's Facebook page, and you can see this is like, what happens. The world's attention focuses on you, and everyone cares about environmental issues. And then you could probably track the color of the water with the color of this decline in participation of the issue. We had this big visual pollution event, and it was different than the persistent pollution, right? A big slug of metals that don't typically make it this far down the waterway did come through town, did make its way down into New Mexico and onto the Navajo reservation. So it is different. Right, it carried a different mix of pollutants much farther down the waterway. So I'm not trying to say that a blowout event is not important, it's not impactful, it is. But what it also really is, it's very galvanizing because it's visible. Persistent pollution sticks around for a long time, and this scene has looked like this for a very, very long time. Even though if you do the math, let's say Gold King had 3 million gallons of water released. If I think I ran the numbers, if you imagine 300 gallons per minute from this one draining adit, and you multiply that by 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, you're looking at hundreds of millions of gallons of polluted water that come from this one site into the Upper Animas watershed all the time. So the good news is, from my perspective anyway, to address persistent pollution and to address blowout concerns, what we're really talking about is it's time to clean up old abandoned mines. The solution for both of these problems is the same. And this is a picture of my little son, who I always try and put in my presentations because he's much cuter than I am. But looking at that spill, and it is kind of interesting to think, like, if you were to say, like, hey, Daddy, like, what is that? Which, he asked me that question 1,000 times a day. How do you explain that? Oh, that's this, like, horrible pollution source that's coming into our waterways, and it does it all the time, and it's done it for decades. And what about it? If that site, if that was literally in downtown Durango, bubbling up orange stuff, and we could see it go into the Animas, we'd probably have like a man to the moon type of effort to like fix that problem. But it's tucked away in the mountains. We don't see it as much, and so it's been going on for a really long time. And now we're going to talk about some of the reasons that we haven't addressed it. But before we do that, whenever we talk about this question of the spill and the Animas, people want to know, well, what is the state of things? And I'm not going to talk about it much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to point you to Mountain Studies' website. And the reason is they've done great science. We all have a lot of feelings wrapped up in what happened because it was scary and traumatizing, and there's lingering concern. But I think that we need to temper all of that with science and with good information to help us make informed decisions moving forward and for how we interact with the waterways. Mountain Studies has on its website so much data, so well presented right now to talk about what metals and what toxins got into the waterway and how they pass through the community and where those levels are right now and what happened during some of the storm surges that happened post the event to reactivate sediment, and it's all there. So don't talk to me, don't talk to your neighbor, start looking at some of this data. From one perspective, it's not as scary as I think a lot of us feared when this event first happened. And then from another perspective, it's further confirmation that there's a lot of nasty stuff in our river. So problems and solutions. This is a bit simplistic. I'll give you that. But I wanted to kind of lay out what I think is a bit of an overarching narrative that sometimes we're missing when we're talking about Gold King response. The first thing I want to acknowledge is that we all want to do something right now to fix the problem. And as Bill Simons, who has worked in the Animas River stakeholder group for many, many years, has reminded me many times, this was a problem 100 years in the making, and it's going to take a little while to get it right. But some of the problems to how we fix this issue of persistent pollution, the threat of blowouts, is money. And we're going to talk about money, and we're going to talk about something really obscure called the 1872 mining law, to get at the heart of just how much money we don't have and why that's hampering some of our cleanup efforts. Another thing is just technical aptitude, right? These are some pretty big, complex problems. There are not easy solutions, and if there were easy solutions, we would have done it already. And then there's another question around responsibility and liability. Who should be doing this work? Who's responsible for it? Who should pay? And if I start cleaning it up, am I going to take on additional liability? And it kind of really wraps people up in not knowing how they can involve themselves in cleanup efforts. And so on the solution side, I'm going to say a couple of things, and this list could be much, much longer, but I'm going to focus on a couple. One is 1872 mining law reform, really arcane, but we're going to go there, folks. We talk a little bit about regulatory reform, and then we're going to talk a bit about good SAM legislation. So 1872 mining law reform, hopefully you've at least heard that term, but I actually think it's incumbent on this community to really understand what this thing is all about. Because I would say that until we as a community and we as a state and we as a nation start addressing 1872 mining law reform, we're never going to clean up our waterways. And never is a big scary word, and I probably shouldn't use it. But mining for hard rock minerals is different than other forms of mining. First off, it's governed by a law that was written when women couldn't vote. I think it was Ulysses S. Grant was the president, and it hasn't changed since then. This was a law written back in the days when you'd have like a pickaxe and a pan to look for gold in a river, and that same law is governing how multinational companies with slightly different technologies go after some very, very valuable minerals. So a couple of things that this law does that are problematic. One is it elevates the mining of minerals above all other uses of public lands, essentially making it so that federal land agencies almost can't prevent a mine if someone wants to make a mine. Now it gets more complicated. There's other ways mines have obviously been stopped. But this law elevates mining to the highest, best use of the land. So if you think that the best use of your land is clean water for our city to drink, you'd be wrong in the eyes of the law. It's actually mining. Whether that mining is done by like a local business or a multinational company that's going to take the profits and bring it up to Canada, it doesn't matter. Those minerals are the highest and best use of the land. Some other things that this law does or doesn't do, there's no environmental standards. But the big kicker, I'm going to, well, actually one is really funny, not funny, funny in my black humor sense of way, is this kind of question of patenting. Back in 1872, for $5 an acre, you could look at stake a claim, and for $5 you could buy that public land. You could privatize that public land. The law hasn't changed. That means for $5 an acre, you can privatize public lands if you stake a claim. Now, there's been a moratorium placed on that, thank God, since I think 1994, but that has to be reauthorized every year. So it's kind of still in this works, like this really arcane idea that for $5 you can privatize public lands and the minerals that go with it. But the real kicker for me, and why I put money as my biggest concern on why we're not doing enough for cleanup, is right here. There are no reclamation or royalty fees on minerals mined under the 1872 mining law reform. Now this is a really big problem, because what that means is there's no money being set aside for cleanup. So right now we have hundreds of thousands of mines across this country that are sitting there leaking nasty stuff. And there's no money to fix the problem. Like, there's no money being set aside for this. And to put this in perspective, back in the 70s, when there was a whole slew of environmental regulations being passed, I think it's called the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, set up a system of royalty and reclamation fee collection from the coal industry. Oil and gas has royalty and reclamation fees. Like almost every other federal mineral, when someone takes it out of the ground and makes a lot of money off of it, they have to give some money back to the taxpayers. And oftentimes some of that money is set aside for reclamation and environmental issues that arise from that activity. Since 1977, from coal mining, $10 billion has been set aside for reclamation. $8 billion has been put into reclamation projects. So if this is the only time I'll ever say this, wouldn't it have been awesome if we had coal mines up there instead of hard rock? No, just kidding. There's this issue of $8 billion have gone into cleaning up old coal sites. And there's still, during that time, since 1977 or 78 when this all got underway, $0 were set aside for cleaning up old hard rock mining sites. So what has happened, there's been a lot of stuff that's been done, and it's through the hard efforts of Animas River stakeholder groups and folks who are trying to figure it out. But this problem is far bigger than our community trying to figure it out. Right, on a previous slide, 500,000 mining sites in the United States that need to be cleaned up at a cost that's estimated between someplace in the $30 to $76 billion. Like, these numbers are staggering. And there is no foundation that's just going to say, hey, I'm going to solve this problem. There's no like local team that's going to, roll up their arm sleeves and fix this. This is a big problem. It's been 100 years in the making. It is based on some serious structural problems with how we have done mining in this country using the 1872 mining law reform. And until we fix this major mechanism of funding, I don't know. We can start picking away at things. And I think that our community will start to address some of these issues. But I think we're a bit of an exceptional community, right? Like, not everyone has the number of folks who are as engaged. Not everyone has the amount of wealth that this community has. And these sites are spread across the entire country. This problem has to be fixed. The good news is right now there are two bills, one in the House and one in the Senate, that are trying to do just that. And really great to see Senator Udall, Heinrich from New Mexico, and also Senator Bennett as co-sponsors on the Senate bill. We don't have to go into the specifics of this, but thank goodness that some of our leaders are stepping up and trying to fix this. The bad news is no one thinks any of this is going to go anyplace in the current Congress. So here's one of these intractable problems. I would say that as a community, we have to put whatever weight we have behind something like 1872 mining law reform. It is a heavy lift. It is a long-term lift. And it doesn't fix our problem right now. But I want us all to know about this, and I want us all to care about it because it's so important. Next is regulatory reform. I'm not going to talk about regulatory reform because regulatory reform is forward-looking, but the point is, without an act of Congress, which is kind of like an act of God these days, the Forest Service and the BLM have rules and regulations for how they manage federal mineral extraction and mining. And through administrative actions, which don't require Congress, those rules can be strengthened. There's no movement that I know of on this, and it wouldn't help us, right? That's for like new mines moving forward. But this is another tool, and hopefully there'll be some traction here. Another thing we've talked about a lot in this community is Good Samaritan legislation. And what I would like to really try and communicate that from the Alliance's perspective, the Good Samaritan legislation is a tool, and it could be a really helpful tool for us here. But it isn't a thing, right? For 10 to 20 years, different versions of Good Samaritan legislation have been bandied about. And they have ranged from what we would consider really good pieces of legislation that would help our communities clean up these issues and deal with concerns around liability, to industry kind of like wish present, like legislation that would basically like do things like gut the Clean Water Act, right? So Good Sam legislation is an important tool for us as a community to also be advocating for. Trout Unlimited has done a great job of really kind of raising the profile on this issue, but it's also legislative, which means its chances of moving forward, well, probably better than 1872, are still, it's still legislation. That's all I'll say. It's going to be hard. And what Good Sam legislation gets passed is really important. There are things that the environmental community and that folks who care about clean water and liability would rip their hair out over and would, fall on their swords to make sure it never got passed. So Good Sam isn't a thing. It's an idea. It's a tool. It can be a good tool. It can be a bad tool. And we need to continue evaluating how this legislation moves forward. Again, some great leadership from our local congressional delegation. There is a piece of draft legislation that's been floated for discussion. So there is some discussion around Good Sam. Again, the chances of it passing, what does it actually look like, are still really active questions. With regards to local cleanup efforts, there's been a lot of discussion in the press recently around what's happening. And so much of the effort is now shifting towards a focus on Superfund. It is important to note that for the last 20 years, Animas River Stakeholders Group has been spearheading a lot of cleanup efforts in the headwaters. $20 million has been spent on remediation efforts. A lot of different sites have been cleaned up. And for a while, water quality was getting a lot better. And then without going into the specifics, some things happened. A wastewater treatment plant that used to be up Cement Creek was dismantled, and lo and behold, water quality started getting a lot worse. That's not to discredit the good work that's been done, and probably even more important than the good work that Animas River Stakeholders Group has actually accomplished is the understanding that we have of this complex situation. We know more, I would guess, that we know more in terms of the many different sources of pollution in the upper Animas, the types of pollutant that's coming, from which sources, and which relative contribution. We have this big jump start on any community that's saying like, oh wow, we have a problem, we've got to fix it. We actually really know what the problem is, where it is, and we have a good sense of where we should focus our efforts in terms of cleanup. And that really is the result of Animas River Stakeholders Group. So I want to give them their due there because they've done good work. We know much more about the Animas River than we ever would have without their efforts. And we still have a big problem that we still need to work as a community together to fix. And then on Superfund, right, that's where all the discussion is happening right now. And I think that there's good reason for that. Some of what the Animas River Stakeholder Group has done is address the sites that they can. There are some other sites that Animas River Stakeholders Group, even with Good Sam legislation, would not be trying to fix. They are big, scary, technical sites, and some of them have what are called PRPs, or potentially responsible parties, people who might be responsible to pay. So even with Good Sam, they're not going after these sites, and these are the biggest, nastiest sites. And so that's why so much discussion is happening right now around Superfund. Superfund seems like a tool to address some of the biggest, scariest, most expensive, most technical, and most polluting sites that we have yet to get our hands around. And this makes sense, right? That's what Superfund does. It does it all around the country. It takes on the hardest challenges. Our community has done a great job of taking on some of the other challenges, but now we're putting a lot of faith and a lot of hope that Superfund can bring the technical resources as well as the financial resources to address some of our most polluting sites in the Upper Animas. And I think folks probably know it's a really active discussion right now. La Plata County has passed a resolution in support of Superfund. The city of Durango has requested of the governor Superfund site listing. San Juan County and Silverton are in negotiations with EPA. They're a little bit closer to the site, have a little bit more specific concerns. The deadline for making that request of the EPA has been moved, I believe, to the end of this month. And from what I hear, I think there's a lot of hope that we're going to get there. So with any luck in the next couple of weeks, at least by the end of the month, our combined communities are going to coalesce around this request of Superfund site designation. And you know what that's going to do? It's going to start a whole another long process, another big lift, another request for a lot of vigilance and awareness and participation from all of the affected communities up and down the Animas watershed. So there are no silver bullets up here. But the great thing to know is what the Animas spill and what the Gold King spill taught us all very well is how we are so all in this together. So if there is a need for political might, if there is a need for resources, if there is a need for people and minds and energy and activity, it's not just Silverton that should be lifting this, right? We all have a role. Everyone up and down, this entire watershed, we're affected by the Gold King spill, are affected by the persistent pollution that gets into our waterways every minute of every day, and need to be part of the solution. And I think that coming out of Gold King spill, we all will be much more engaged. One last thing I'll say is that to help with that advocacy, kind of bringing together those voices, that watershed advocacy work, the Alliance, and I've been saying this for maybe too long now, is in the process of relaunching the Animas RiverKeeper. The Waterkeeper Alliance sets up organizations called RiverKeepers. They're typically focused on a particular watershed, and their job is to protect and clean up that watershed. Started with the Hudson RiverKeeper, and now over 270 rivers across the world have dedicated RiverKeepers. The Alliance is reviving the Animas RiverKeeper to make sure that in addition to all of our collective efforts, we can have a rallying spot for hard advocacy, for folks who say, we need this cleaned up, there's no now, soon. And we're gonna do what we need as a community to not only help fix our river and our watershed, but to also lend our political support to these other big arcane things like 1872 mining law reform and Good Sam legislation, because we know what it's like to be an affected community. So with that, I would just say thank you, and I think we probably have a couple of minutes for questions. And thanks everybody for coming out. Love to see everybody at Green Business Roundtable.